Well, let me introduce myself first. Or Steve, do you want to go first? Because you have to leave sooner than I do.
No, but I expect that you'll do most of the talking. So I'm Steve.
I get along real well.
I worked at Wizards of the Coast for about 16 years, working on things like Magic and Duel Masters, Dungeons and Dragons. And then I worked at PopCap and did some of my own design freelance work. And now I'm a game producer over at Ravensburger, helping them with making games good and fun, and also occasionally designing a couple if necessary.
So I've been in the game industry a bit longer than Steve. I actually started with a company called FASA, if anybody knows the game Shadowrun. It's a role-playing tabletop game. I was a creator on that and worked on that through 3 editions of the role-playing game. So I did world creation, role-playing game mechanics, all that kind of stuff. I left FASA as it was closing and merging with a company called WizKids. And at WizKids, I designed, I worked on Mage Knight, but I designed HeroClix. If you're familiar with the Clicks game, they're both still, HeroClix is still available, but I did the original work at HeroClix. I worked on all the games that WizKids ever produced. I was somehow involved in the design or development of those games, including things that involved Major League Baseball or NASCAR or Pirates of the Caribbean. It was all over the map. I left WizKids to like a lot of the people in Seattle ended up going like Steve did to electronic companies. So there was a period of time where board games were very they were where the marketplace was. So I ended up bouncing around to a lot of places that were making games for phones or games that I don't even know if it was such a short-lived period of time, but there was a very big peak in interest in like games for Facebook, for instance, like that. So I did those types of games for a bunch of years. I ended up back and working on Shadowrun for their electronic game that came out on Steam, and then also the BattleTech game that came out on Steam. But then I moved to Electronic Arts, and I worked in their divisions that were making app-based games at EA. When they closed my studio, I did freelance work, did my own games, so I understand what it's like being on the side that you guys are on of trying to convince a publisher to make a game. And I did that for a few years. I got a game published, like both Steve and I both have published games under our names, and then was lucky enough to get picked up by Ravensburger to start working back what I did originally back on tabletop and board games. So it's a long, crazy story. I can give you more info on any of it, but that's, not necessarily where we want to spend our time. And then the key about what happened at Ravensburger, though, is different. When I started with Ravensburger in North America, so for those of you who only know Ravensburger as the company that makes puzzles, that's a problem that the company did. It's not like games are new. In fact, Ravensburger started by making games. So in Europe, for the people who are from Spain, you'll know Ravensburger makes a lot of games. They've always made games since the 1800s. Late 1800s, they made their first game. They've always been a game company. Puzzles actually came later because they set up all the things to make games, and then they would sit for a long time in between games. So they figured, but we'll just use the machines to start making puzzles. But on this side of the ocean, that wasn't the case. So I'm going to give you a little history, little history lesson that kind of hopefully explains. And if I'm talking too fast or you want me to slow down or repeat, just tell me I'm talking too fast. Steve tells me I'm talking too fast all the time. So a bunch of years ago, so the way the world was looked at games, European game companies assumed they were the biggest market for games by far. There was no other, they didn't even think the North American markets, Asian markets, rest of the world, that they even mattered. They were just, small change. They didn't really have any market there. So they never really put effort in. If you were a hardcore American gamer and you were playing things like Avalon Hill games, the big war games, they didn't even, Germany and Europe didn't even think those games were worth the time of day. Things like Hasbro with like Monopoly or some of those games, they saw those games, but to them that was like wacky stuff the US did. And it was not really important in the big picture of games. So what ended up happening was, for years, that was the divide. If you wanted a game from Europe, like I have games from Europe from the, when I was going to Europe every year, they have a very big game convention in Germany, and I would want to buy a German game. I would have to buy it in German and then go online or find someone to translate it into English for me. They would not even bother to do it, even for the England. They didn't even make games for them. So in fact, I tell this story, at this big giant German convention, there was one English guy who had a table no bigger than what you would put a typewriter. It was a typewriter then, it wasn't even a computer. And you would buy your German game and you would take it to him and pay him, $5-10. And he would translate the rules and type it up and give you a sheet of paper with the rules so that you could take the rules with you. I have boxes that have these crazy sheets of paper in them because the Germans didn't care. That was the US market in English didn't matter. That all changed with the advent of two really important games, one going that way and then one coming this way. Like, for instance, Dungeons and Dragons, that was a second-rate game in Germany. They had their own fantasy world. They had their own game. So Dungeons and Dragons didn't count, but Magic the Gathering did. So that was a big thing. They had never heard of collectible card games. They never did it. So when Magic went to Europe, that was a really big thing, especially because they were printing there and they could get, you can get your own edition in your own language. That was pretty big going that way. But again, still not coming from Europe to the US. The big change was the game we all know, Catan, if you're familiar with Catan. Catan was the one that kind of pushed open the door to European games. And when it came here, it again was kind of put into what we call the hobby stores. It wasn't in the big stores, but it became the game that when a person played a game and showed it to a non-gamer, then a new player, that person went, oh, this is a really cool game. I'm gonna grab it. Where do I go? Oh, you have to go to this hobby store, this game store, whatever it is. But its sales were constant and going, and to the point that it eventually went into Target or Walmart or one of the big superstores. At that point, during this period of time, more and more of these German style games were coming, but they were all done by small publishers. Or in the case like Ravensburger, we sold our games to other people. So we had, for instance, Castles of Burgundy or Puerto Rico, and those games were sold to Rio Grande Games, and Rio Grande Games would put them out. But Ravensburger just never think that any games from Germany would really matter in the US. That was a big business mistake, but a lot of companies made that same mistake. Eventually, they realized that as the world became more global and you can buy a game from anywhere in the world now, and you can do that. A lot of the companies like Ravensburger realized, wait a second, we need to do better. We have a puzzle distribution in the US because puzzle doesn't need any languages. It's a puzzle. But we don't have any way to get our games there. So they started kind of taking the puzzle team and turning them into game people, and that didn't work either. That was a pretty bad move for Ravensburg. And so what they tried to do, what Ravensburger said is, we're late. All these other game companies are here in the US. They're selling their games into the market. Catan and is in, like I said, the big stores like Target and Walmart. And the other stuff, we're just falling behind. So how do we catch up? So what Ravensburger did was look at a bunch of tiny US companies to decide where they wanted to go. And they found a company here in Seattle called Wonderforge, and that was doing things bigger than their size. Wonderforge had contracts with Disney, for instance, and with Nickelodeon TV and all these kids properties, which was unheard of for such a tiny company. It was like 4 or 5 people, and they had these big licenses, and they were doing games that went right into Target and Walmart, bypassing the hobby store, and they made games for kids. And this was all the kind of check marks that Ravensburger would like to have. They weighed against a handful of other companies and decided to go with this Wonderforge company. And so Ravensburger, what is it, Steve, about 7 years ago, I guess, purchased Wonderforge. And then just let it be a kids game company, making games for kids, making games for using only the properties that they had, and maybe getting a couple of new ones, Dr. Seuss and things like that. And then they had an external partner that was making them these games. So they were just publishing only. They were just a publishing house. They didn't make games. They didn't have any production. They had production, but they didn't have anybody doing any new design or anything. They just bought a finished game and then put it out. As they kind of established themselves up here in Seattle and started bringing in games from Europe, there was this big disconnect between something that's like, Mickey Mouse, and a German board game. And they were like, well, that's 2 different markets, and we're not doing certain things, and we're not making good family games. So a German family game is very different than an American family game. And so, and on top of it, the look and feel of the games were all wrong. The European style and the North American style did not match. You looked at a game from Europe and you're like, ew, what's that? And so the very first thing they did about 5 years ago, was hire some in-house art designers. So these guys, led by Shane, they went and they did the artwork. They made art look better for us. Then about 2.5 years ago, they brought me in to start to develop a design house for them. And then about 18 months ago, or about a year ago, or just over a year ago, I think now, we brought Steve in to turn us into a full-fledged development studio, art studio, production studio. So a full line specifically dedicated to making games for North America. So that's kind of like the longer story than what I had told Pepe when we met, about where we are and who we are right now. So who we are right now and what we're looking for and what we're trying to do, that's a totally different thing. And I'm, like I said, I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will send to Pepe, and then he could share it with all the students there, about our philosophy for North America. This is only for the North American team. It's not the German team. We think about games and do things differently. Simply put, over the last, basically since I started about 2.5 years, we started doing games that were much more, they're still property driven, meaning that we need to have a partner, but they're much more, a little bit deeper, a little bit more, sorry, I'm trying to figure out where my chat window is and where it went. I had it open and then I lost it. Oh, there it is.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm distracting Mike from time to time. For Carlos, your question about which was the first game opened the way in America for Ravensburger. Mike, do you know? Because I'm not sure if there was any particular one.
The one that is now people associate most with us, well, there's two, really. The biggest one is Castles of Burgundy. If you're familiar with Castles of Burgundy, that's at the high end, what we would call our Alea brand, which Alea does like 60-plus minute games, 90-minute games, very strategic games. The other one would be Labyrinth. If you're familiar with Labyrinth, that is the model that they use to try to, that's the reason Labyrinth was never sold to another company. It's always been under Ravensburger. That one is the one that most people associate with us when they hear our name. Somebody else had their hand up. I saw somebody's hand. No,
I don't think it was a question as much as
okay.
agreement.
So those two games, I think, are the ones most associated in at least the U.S. with us right now. There are now new games that have come out since we've been established here. But like I said, we started out to do games that use current IP. So 2.5 years ago, we came out with Disney Villainous. I'm not sure if any people know Disney Villainous. So that was our big announcement to the world that we are our own development company, design and development company. That hit the same year as another key type of game we started to make, which was Jurassic Park. So not only are we taking an IP and doing something different with it, like Villainous, but we were doing these, what we call recreate a movie or movie games. And these had not been seen in the same fashion. There have been people who've taken like a movie and put it on Monopoly or Uno or something like that. That's, but nothing that's done a game like we did. Yes, and Jaws. Jaws is the new one. And this past year, we just came out with, Steve worked on Back to the Future. And we came out with Marvel Villainous. I'm looking over at my list. Hocus Pocus, a lot of Disney stuff because they love us a lot, and we get first shot at a lot of things. Yeah. Right. So the movie in a box type model is what we do. We are trying to do one of those every year, and then also some nostalgia pieces. And we've been doing some stuff for Disney, like Jungle Cruise and things like that. So that model has been very successful for Ravensburger North America. Now, when Ravensburger became super global like this, and we started our own division and making our own games for our own markets, what ended up happening is that we just did. We realized that we needed to stay better in touch with our European team of developers and developers for sure. So what ends up happening is we have a weekly meetings where we talk to them. We know what games they're working on. We know what games we're working on, so that if somebody brings me a game and that's not meets our needs, we have all these divisions now that we can send games to. So we have Germany that makes the Alea style Castles of Burgundy game. We have other divisions. The French division really loves party games. So we you know, if it's something that we're not going to do here, we'll send it on to the French team to have a look at. The UK team, their specialty is kids games. And then we move on to, like, we even have a company we purchased in the United States called Think Fun. I don't have any idea if anybody's really familiar with them, but they do puzzles and logic games and STEM educational games. So we now have this whole thing that you can show me a game and I can say, no, that's not right for us, but it is right for somebody else in the Ravensburger family. We're trying to cover the whole game spectrum. We're still probably not going to ever do a 8-hour war game, you know, that's probably beyond anything that we want to do. But we will, you know, we are going to look at everything anybody sends us. So from a relationship with developers, Steve and I will always look at games. Even if you go, if you, in your mind, you think to yourself, that's not a Ravensburger game. The fact of the matter is we'll still look at it. One, because we know what we're looking for down the line 2-3 years. And we may say, wow, this isn't what right now, or the theme may not be right, but we can really use this going forward for something else. Let's see. That's kind of the history and where we stand today. And so let me give you a little bit more stuff on what Steve and I would actually look for. If you were just talking to us about what we were looking for in a game, and Steve, you can chime in at any point here. But in North America, we kind of have two bosses that we listen to. The first one is IP, property driven. We are always trying to take a game and figure out, can we work this with something? So for instance, you know, we see a game and we look at it and we say, does this work for a bunch of Disney properties or a bunch of movies? And that's our first driver. That's the first thing my boss is going to say, because the second part is, we are not a hobby game company. We're a mass market family game company. So we're going to always look at your game to say, can I sell this in Target or Walmart or on Amazon with keywords that will always bring a family to that product? So we look at length of gameplay. We rarely take games over an hour in gameplay. We look at simple rules that can be multi-generational. So parents can play with kids, sometimes even grandma and grandpa. We have a whole classification instead of guidelines if we want it to be what we call a light family game, which means grandma can join or grandpa can play. So it's multi-generational. We also look at games that are, like I said, playable in under an hour. We have different categories in our mind. We say this is a family strategy game versus a family light game, but the word family is always there. It's always in that setup. Now, that doesn't mean that our game, something like Villainous and Horrified, those games are like deeper and more, have a lot more strategy to them, but we try to present them. And so those would fall into the family strategy game. We don't expect this to be the game that, gamers are crunching at, all day for hours and hours. We expect this to be a game families pull out to play at night or, in a family group session. And so we have those two kind of pillars that Steve and I need to always keep in mind. That doesn't mean that your game idea, you show us your game, we don't expect you to put all those parts together. We expect you to make a game, and then Steve and I look at it together, and then we go, man, we have many games that we've looked at that are not coming out with the theme that was originally concepted for them, or with and in some cases even the tone of the game may have shifted from, this is a serious game about monsters, and then we've changed it to be this lighter game using another property. And we try to do that constantly. And so sometimes we agree. We say, hey, we want to take a look at this game because we think it fits this model. Now, that's model A. Model B is we also are, and Steve and I are responsible for the kids' games in North America. This is different than in Europe. Europe has a whole separate kids game division, but in the US and in North America, Steve and I also do the kids games. So like I do matching. At one point, one part of my day I'm working on Marvel Villainous, and the other thing I'm trying to see if this cute dinosaur matches this other cute dinosaur. It's like jumping back and forth between multiple things. Steve is working on some other kids games right now. So we have to also look at games that we think are light and fun and, for lack of a better term, simple, that could fit into that kids market as well. Again, that's our responsibility and our way to go. Steve and I fight and push for games we want. We look at a game, and if we think there's something in that game that's cool, a mechanic or a new combination of how mechanics work, we'll keep that game and move it on to the next phase, which is to show it to the bigger team and say, we really like this mechanic. Can we figure out what we can use this mechanic for? We have a couple games still on our shelves now that we keep finding, pushing, trying to make new ideas for this core mechanic loop that a designer has shown us. And so we always sit down and think two things. How do I convince my boss that he can sell this game? That's Steve and mine's number one thing. If you show me a game and I can't figure out how I can convince anybody else to sell it, then I'm probably going to say no. At the same time, we also have a second thing, which is Steve and I love mechanics and love seeing how games work. And so when we see something cool, we'll tell you it's cool. We'll also tell you maybe we can't do anything with it, but we'll tell you it's cool, give you advice, try to push you to somebody who might publish it. Because to our way of thinking, if we help you get published, you're always going to think of us as somebody who's going to be helpful to you. And that's our goal, is to be I worked in the industry a really long time. So my thought is, at this point in my life, it's about relationships. I don't want to tell you no and then just slam the door on you. I want to tell you no, try these guys or go over there. Or, if you did this to this game, maybe I'll look at it again. Because, we need new blood, always new ideas, always fresh ideas, always thinking of a new mechanic, a new presentation. And we don't know where they come from. They could come from you guys, all of you. It could come from somebody who's never made a game before. It could be an old veteran just happens to think of a new idea. So we don't shut that door down at all, ever. So that's kind of where we go. We kind of drive in the middle lane of the highway. On one side is properties that the licensor, our licensing team, and my bosses are looking for, and the other side is getting it into mass market, and we're in the little car in between, trying to find all the good ideas that can fit both those things without causing panic and craziness. I'm willing to answer questions. Steve, what do you got, Steve?
Well, I was just going to bring up, I'm sorry, I was answering questions, so I'm not sure what all you covered, but some of the things that are valuable for me when I take a look at the game is whether or not you've play tested it. That I've had a number of games come to me and they're like, I haven't tried this game yet, but here it is. It's almost always going to have some pretty massive flaws in it. So that's, I'm sure you guys already know that, but it's just something that sticks out a lot. I would keep in mind when you're designing a game that your first prototype probably isn't going to work out well. That's the one that you should take probably the least amount of time making it look good and just get it together so that you can play in order to find the path that you want to go down. A lot of the times you'll find that you have an idea and you get it written out and you put things together and try it. And after that first test, there's some idea or some part about it that you really like, that you really want to focus on. and that will take you down the path of that game. I think that that's super important to follow that path. And while you're developing, just try out the different things. Like, there's been a number of times where people think that an aspect of a game is really good. For example, Back to the Future, this became a fairly large story for our designers. Originally, they had two different sets of dice. You were either Marty or you were the Doc, with the dice. And the problem was is that it didn't play out as well. And so when I initially suggested that they try the dice as just the dice and make sure that all of the icons were even, they were really skeptical and they really didn't want to do that. But once they tried it, it worked out really well for them and it made the game a lot better. So just even if mechanics kind of work, you can always try it in slightly different ways. Don't spend a lot of time doing that, but just try it with an extra one of these or an extra dice or one less dice. Especially when it comes to mechanics or things, if you try without that mechanic and you don't miss it, then it's not justified on being there, right? That's something that's come up a lot in playtests where something has been sort of a catching point for people, but they don't want to remove it. They feel like it's integral to the game. If you just try it without it and nobody misses it, then you're not losing anything by removing it. And then for us, like, we love adding the immersion to games. So even little things make a big difference. Flavor text here and there really help drive the IP. That's less on the designers coming up with things and more on us, but it is kind of nice to see when designers take those small bits and add them in and think about it a little bit early. Those are my comments. So,
from my standpoint, when I look at a game, what I want you to tell me is, what does the player do on their turn? Okay. I don't need to know the end game. I don't need to know 25 minutes of setup. I want you to say to me, on your turn, you do X, Y, Z, whatever, because I believe if you're not having fun at the table, that game never gets played a second time. So I need to ensure, my feeling is I need to ensure that a player at the table is having fun. And I can't judge that unless you tell me what a player does. So telling me, it's a worker placement game and you play at the beginning of your turn, you place your guys. And then 5 minutes later you go, oh, wait, I forgot. You also do these 11 other things. I'm like, wait, whoa, what just happened here? No. You need to be able to tell me what a player is going to do so that I can understand what a player's thinking about and what a player then does in his actions, and then what the ramifications of those actions are. If I don't understand that, what I call that core loop there of the player, I'm not talking about the big engine of the game. That's a different discussion that we talk about separately. But a lot of times what ends up happening is the big construction of this giant game engine is the most important thing, and the designer forgets that there's players, and the players have to do those things. So when you sit down, and all the stuff Steve says is paramount, but once you are done with that kind of concept, watch what a player does. Can they play the game without you telling them what to do? Can they are there cool decisions there that they're doing, or is it the same thing every time? And you're like, I need to hear you tell me, when you're selling me a game, here's what a player does on their turn. And it needs to be interesting enough for me to then ask questions. I say this because a lot of the newer idea people tend to design as if they're the player and they know all the tricks already. So that's cool. And that's where you start. Like Steve says, that's where you start when you're just moving pieces around and trying to come up with mechanics. But there's a second step that a lot of designers, inventors don't do, which is Now, what if it's not me playing the game? What if it's another player playing the game? What do I need to tell them to make the game as interesting that, in my mind, what I think the game is to what the game is actually at? My story, like Steve talked about, that my game that I did called Everyone Loves a Parade, I had a very clear goal of what I wanted what I wanted to happen in the game. The biggest problem is that wasn't fun for players. It was a really cool test to figure out how to get there by me, and I still think it's doable. But for this game, which was a very light family game, it didn't work. It was two opposites, and so I had to cut out, as Steve said, something I really liked and still want and still think is important to get a game done that made people have fun at the table. So I'm really a stickler for that. I think fun at the table, maybe it's because I started in role-playing games, I don't know, but it is fun at the table is the key to me to get you to play a second time. And when you play a second time, then people will most likely play a third and fourth and fifth time. Nobody goes, I played a game 3 times and I'm done. They usually say, I played the game 1 time and I didn't like it and I'm not playing again. No one says that after like 3 or 4 times. By that time, they're playing the game pretty regularly. That's when I ask a game, if I'm really in a deep discussion with you on a game, I'm going to eventually ask you, what's a player's turn? What are they doing? What are their decision points? Because that's going to help me judge the possible success of this game, and what I can, like I said, eventually go to my supervisors and say, sell this game. The other thing is that, and this is something I think Steve and I have discovered through people using, I don't know if you guys are all familiar with Tabletop Simulator or any of those types of programs. What ends up happening with those games, those things are that while they mimic the player turn and what happens at the table, they're not they're not exactly right. There's a little delay, there's a little manipulation that's different. And using that as, oh, on Tabletop Simulator, all these things work perfectly, that's not how it actually will play on a table. And there's kind of like this mind block with people that says Tabletop Simulator worked perfect, and then you can ask it like a bunch of questions, and then it'll start to kind of fall apart. So use Tabletop Simulator as a tool, like Steve said early on about just making and doing things, but also realize it's only a tool. It's not the end. There's a lot of missing parts in there that cause anxiety when you bring it up and start to show people what's going on. And then I think, and this is, I know it's on Steve's list of things that you don't want to do while you're developing your game, or, so you have your idea, you started it, you're on the process for it. The biggest element is when something isn't working, don't add on to it. You'll hear people constantly talk about something like over-design. This game's been over-designed. What that means, at least in the way Steve and I interpret that, is you have, let's say, a core mechanic, and then you start to add onto it. It's not working. It's something about it's not right. What you actually need to do, and Steve said this earlier, and I'm just kind of reinforcing, is you actually have to go under the hood. Putting another paint job on it and adding more parts to it and making it bigger never fixed the actual problem. And now all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, now you roll 2d6. Oh, and in order to make the game work, you now have to roll 2d10. Well, what? Why? What just happened there? You have to always reduce or break apart or deconstruct to reconstruct. I like to use deconstruct a lot. So you always want to deconstruct your game. You want to tear it apart down to what you consider to be the smallest part. When something's not working, if there's some weird player interaction going on, don't add 5 new rules to the game to fix that. look at that player interaction, deconstruct what's happening, and maybe do it a little different. That's really the number one kind of problem that Steve and I see, even in games that we like. And we say, let's take this game, let's move it to the next level, let's show everybody the game. We still have a kick line of things that we go, yeah, we're probably going to cut this mechanic because we don't even understand why it's in the game. And then you talk back to the designer or the inventor, and they're like, oh, I added it to fix this other thing. Well, no, fix the thing. Don't add new rules. Actually go back and fix the thing that's not working. And so that process, that's literally the blood part of the process. That's where you're literally bleeding over your decisions. You're like, why is this happening? You have to constantly break your game down. When I was a teacher here in Washington, one of the exercises I used to do for people is I would say, oh, tell me a game you want to fix. And then everybody's got, I would love to fix this game. And then I would say, okay, well, tell me, what's your favorite game? Oh, I love, I think Castles of Burgundy is the greatest game ever made. It's my favorite game, blah, blah, blah. And we're like, okay, now pick something in Castles of Burgundy and now fix it. And you'd watch people just, their eyes bug out of their heads. They're like, what? But it's perfect. I'm like, no, it's not perfect. If it's perfect, everybody would play it all the time. People don't like this game. What would you fix? That process of taking something that you really like, and we do it all the time as humans, like we really like Star Wars, but we'll find all the problems and all the things we would fix in Star Wars, or whatever thing we really love. But when it comes to like games and things that people feel they have a stake in, they don't tend to do that. You really kind of have to always be thinking in your games as, how do I slowly over time improve it, or quickly over time, depending on the situation, improve it. And sometimes I have to go back and kind of look at it as if I'm the outsider and break it down and rebuild it up to see that I'm actually doing the things I want to do. So it's hard. It's the worst part. It's the painful part. It's the part where you're being told no. Steve's got some great stories of being told no for his games. And just the fact that you have to understand that, one, you're not everybody's not going to be happy with your game ever. That's standard operating procedure for everything. But what you can be proud of and what you can know that you've taken to the next level and what you're willing to do and change to make it work, that's super important. It's probably the most important thing. Maybe it's a life thing, not just a game thing, but it's for games, it's really important to know, here's how this breaks down. Here's how I fixed it. And it gives you a good sense of being able to discuss your game with somebody. So you show it to somebody and they come back to you with stuff. You can say, hey, I already broke that down. Here's what I came up. Here's what testing does. Here's what happens when you play it. Those having all those answers, it makes it so much easier to sell your game, to be in a position to sell your game, to be confident about showing your game. So that, I think, what was that part?
Have we covered over-designed and making sure that your game makes sense to someone who hasn't been working on it?
Yeah.
One of my things is that when Mike and I look at a game, we've never seen it before. We haven't heard you talk about it. You haven't explained anything to it. And if you hand me a pack of 10 cards and say, okay, now draft 2, I'm going to look at you and go, what's going on? And I'm a hardcore gamer. Like I've played Magic forever. I know what drafting means. But if you hand me a bunch of cards and tell me to draft, I'm not going to know what you want me to do because I'm not going to know how to evaluate any of the cards. And that makes me feel stupid. So if you're going to have a player draft at the start of your game, make sure that the game is so intuitive that they don't need to ask you questions about every single card, because that won't make any sense. And that sort of goes along with what I've said in the past of over-designed, where you will understand your game better than anyone else. You will understand the ins, the outs, everything. And so if you ever get to the point in a game design where you're like, this isn't complicated enough. This is too simple. This is dull. Step back for a second and think about it from someone who hasn't actually looked at that game before, because you'll run into a lot of cases where it was good where it was at, and by adding more to it to make sense to you on how complicated or how strategic the game is, it will lose its value to a new player that hasn't seen that game, because it will be well past them, and they will have never seen that first step in order to get to the second step. And again, I apologize if I'm restating things that were said. I'm trying to handle two things.
Yeah. So if you are looking at here's a thing that also Steve and I have to look at when we are evaluating games for Ravensburger North America. Always understand that when I'm talking about that mass market IP mindset. We have to look at things that are we have to sell the game to Target for Target to sell it. So we're not talking with the greatest, most advanced gamers in the world. We're talking with salesmen and women and people. And they are looking at how do they make good decisions for their market. So one of the things that we have to constantly be aware of for ourselves is, when is a mechanic standard in the game industry? Drafting, as Steve just said, worker placement per se. What's Gloomhaven? What's it called? I keep thinking it's campaign. What's the actual word?
The legacy game?
Legacy style games. These are now games that are now known in the gamer industry as being real choices. Economic model games, all these types of things that you've played with in that you buy, the top games in, that are always on the website, Gloomhaven or Scythe or the Mars game. Oh my God. I can't remember. Sorry.
Mars.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So those types of games, those are huge. Those are huge games with really cool multi-level mechanics and all that kind of stuff that we would never be able to sell that to our buyers at those stores. So we can sell things like, if you look at our games, there's like some cascading and kind of overlapping rules. Villainous is really just a card game. The big selling point was asynchronous victory condition. That's never been done in mass market before. Having the fact that you need X to win, but I need Y to win. That's huge. That's a huge leap of faith that they took, because they look at it and say, our consumer doesn't understand legacy game. They're not going to understand a game that you play, quote unquote, one time. They're not going to understand a game that, as Steve says, has a drafting mechanic in which you already have to kind of understand how the game plays before you can play the game. That doesn't go. We're trying to figure out how to get certain co-op games are actually really new to the mass market, and we've been on the cutting edge with some of them. Even back, if you look at our first one, which was Jurassic Park, it was asynchronous gameplay. The dinosaurs, much like Jaws, they had one had a victory. One team had a victory that did this, and the other team had a victory that did that. That was pretty radical to get into the store, because those games aren't in the stores, are Monopoly or Operation or, those kind of Catan was a big stretch. In fact, for everybody who needs to understand how slow it takes for that to change, has to realize that until last year, Dungeons and Dragons never appeared in Target. Okay? So we're talking a game that we all consider to be one of the, pillars of games. That never even appeared there because they couldn't figure out how a Target or Walmart shopper would ever buy this game. Where do they know it from? How do they play it? It's a set of books. There's no dice, all that kind of stuff. It is a unique position that we put ourselves in. but it also puts some criteria on decisions that Steve and I make. Even something, so like, doing Villainous was that way. Back to the Future with its co-op dice drafting and dice choice. That was like it was dice. They got dice. They understand rolling the dice and trying to pick what you want to do. But it was like putting it all together in a logical game way for that marketplace. Princess Bride's going to push it in a different direction. Horrified as a total co-op game in which the monsters had a quote unquote AI that moved them around. Again, very new to that marketplace. So we're not looking, well, to be perfectly honest, Steve and I love a really cool, new, awesome, out of the world mechanic, or the use of a mechanic combined in some new way. We have to then look at it and say, can this even go into the marketplace? We have to like literally rethink our thought and sell one aspect of it. So coming to us with a game that's got 5 new mechanics that no one's ever seen or combined, and we're going to have to slide it back down in order to get it to our market. Now, that said, if we think it's still really cool as is, we'll take it to the German team and say, dudes, you need to publish this game because it's doing stuff we can't do for our market, but we'll let you do it, and then we'll bring it over and put it into the hobby market here in the US or whatever. That's a business decision that the company makes a lot. Steve and I have sent a couple games, and a couple of them have gone all the way to the point of production for games that are not for our market. I mean, not for the mass market. For the hobby market, what we call the hobby market or the specialty shop, yes, 100%. But we're not in, technically my boss is not in that business. He will always tell us, how do I get this into Target or Walmart? We're like, oh, God, all right, well, we would have to maybe do this. Or we'll put an IP, putting Disney on something's a big driver, to people to buy it. So we have to constantly think in those, Steve and I have to constantly triangulate with an inventor how all the things work together to get a product out. It's not just, you have a good game, let's publish it. We have to think of 4 different layers of you have a good game and where does it fit in the greater Ravensburger picture. So yeah, that's also another thing. And finally, as Pepe was part of this long international Ravensburger inventor thing, a couple of things I want to talk about that, just stuff from our side of the fence, if you will, to people who are going to be presenting games. Think of it as it's not this formal, but try to think of it as a job interview. You're trying to sell us something. We've never met you in theory, we don't know who you are. Don't come unprepared. Don't come and act as if you're doing us a favor. You try to be professional about it. Try to understand who, you're trying to sell us something that can make us both, my company and you, a really good percentage of money. So come to the meeting, prepared and understand and know, sometimes you can do some research into the company, and hopefully you don't need to now. I've given you enough history to last a lifetime, but do some research, find out what kinds of games we're looking for. Find out if you can say, okay, I've made this game. I have it themed to be, a food fighting game, but you can turn it into a fun game for kids or something like that. You need to come and have a sense of idea of who you are, who we are, and what you can do for us. That's your job. Don't come unprepared. Don't come with an unfinished game. As Steve said, you've got to test it. You have to come further along the process than just literally, hey, I'm an inventor. Here's my game, and throw it on the table like it's nothing. If you don't care, it's really hard for us to care. So that's number one. And number two, and this is going to sound crazy to say, and It's, don't assume you're the greatest game designer who ever lived and you're doing us a big favor. Don't come in and say, well, I fixed Monopoly and now here's the game, so this game will be bigger than Monopoly. That doesn't happen. Don't come in and say, I've created, I didn't like Gloomhaven, so I recreated it and did this other thing. That we're not going to listen to you. We're going to be like, that's fine. The idea of you coming into that saying, your business is bad and I'm going to fix it. No, we're not gonna. Our business is not bad. We're doing actually really well. So you don't come in with the attitude of you're fixing. You're going to do us a favor. That doesn't work. It doesn't work because we're seeing. Here there's how many people are online? 20 some people online. Each one of you guys comes up and says, hey, I'm going to fix everything that you've done. The answer is no, you're not, because that's what the last guy said and we rejected him. And now you're saying the same thing. We're not going to listen to that anymore. That's just not, it doesn't help anything. It's actually more, Steve and I talk about this all the time. What we're looking for is a partner. We're looking for someone that we go, hey, we really like what you did here. How do we make this work? If you say, I'm not going to do that, or I'm better than this, or I'm, you don't know who I am, that kind of stuff is like, no, that's irrelevant. I'm trying to get a partnership because we want your game to succeed. And here's what I have to do to convince my bosses to make it succeed. Here's what I need you to do to help me do that. As Steve said, you're not in the room when we take your game to the next set of people. So if you're not a partner with us or helping us get to that next level, I can't really be confident that I can get your game moving to the next part. So, consider when you're showing a game, a respectful situation. Yes, it's games. We're all making games when it's all said and done. We're not scientists trying to get rid of COVID. We're not, all doing, doctors or anything like that. We're making games for fun, but for people to have fun, but we still have to follow a protocol that makes sense. Let's see, Steve has been typing away, so there's those. And then, I don't know, Steve, do you have anything else? We just did like hundreds of interviews, so we kind of know now a little bit more about what we're trying to do.
Hundreds of interviews. You're talking about the Game Inventor Days?
Yeah.
I will say with the Game Inventor Days, and especially in these current times, it's difficult to show a game. And I heard Mike talking about being prepared for online showings. Like, it's really hard to get the game idea across a lot of the time. Even though you can talk about it and explain it, it's much harder for us to get the feel of the game. If you have Tabletop Simulator or Tabletopia, sharing the screen is always very nice. And being able to explain things from there is helpful. I would say that probably helped the most people on the Game Inventor Days.
The other thing is, I'm trying to figure out how to say this so that it makes a little bit of sense. If you have a game that has multiple kinds of mechanics, so let's say there's card drafting and worker placement, and don't give me a kick line of game mechanic keywords that you've used, that you found that you're using. Because if you show me a game and it's got like 8 game concepts in it, 8 game mechanics in it, I'm going to look at that and say, again, as we're talking, I'm just going to say no. Even though when you play the game, your worker placement is basically, I put somebody over here to show that I did this action, and it's very light. You just understand that putting more mechanics in your game doesn't necessarily make it a better game. And telling me I have worker placement, when really all you have is a token to show that you did something. That's not really what, don't put that in your sell sheet. Don't put in, 8 different things. Try to find the one or two things that a player does on their turn that you think is the selling point. Hey, in this game, you're buying and, it's a buying and trading game. And so, and it's got match or set collection. I don't need to know that it's also got worker placement, blah, 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 to indicate that you've done certain things, because all that becomes is noise to me. I look at it and I go, oh my gosh, there's 8 game mechanics in here. I can't make this game. But really, when it's all said and done in the gameplay, there's only 1 or 2 that you're actually doing that you would actually do that. Don't think that it shows you're really smart or a really good designer or inventor if you have all these game mechanics in your game. You may have a little hint of something, to indicate the end of turn or whatever, but really when it's all said and done, it's a set collection game. And that's, I only need to know that. I don't need you to say, oh, and look, Mike, I also know what worker placement means and drafting means and push your luck means. I'm like, I can look at your game and you can tell me on your turn what you're doing, and I go, oh, is there a little push your luck, a little got you on that? Yeah, there is. Oh, okay, that's cool. I would rather discover that through you telling me about your game than to read 10 game mechanics on a sheet. Because if I'm going to see that, if you already heard, Steve and I are going to be like, yeah, no, we can't do 10 game mechanics. But that's totally out of our mandate. So just think carefully about what you're presenting. Again, as Steve said, look at it as when somebody's not there. That's not you. That can dismiss things or change the order of things when you're explaining it. You show that to a total stranger and they're going to look at it and go, oh my God, there's 10 different game mechanics in here. And you're like, oh, well, no, not really. It's not really worker placement. That's just end of turn. And it's not really drafting. That's a whole different thing. And it's not, we don't see that because you just handed us a sheet of paper and we're evaluating it a week later in our offices. So you just be very careful with tossing the key game and the hip game words around. That's just not a really good selling point. So that was something else that came out of stuff. We would look at a game and it would be described using, 10 or 12 game mechanics. And we're like, oh my God, what kind of crazy thing is this? And then when you see it, it's like not that at all. And you're like, why did you add all these in there? Oh, because I was thinking this and thinking that. No, don't. You're now overthinking. You're thinking that's important to me when it's actually the opposite. It's actually not important to me. I don't actually care what game mechanics you put in your game. I just want to see your game. Like I said, for me at the table and what the player does. So I guess that's been an hour of me mainly talking with Steve, sometimes talking. So if you have other questions or anything that we might be able to help guide you or give you advice on, more than happy to.
Hey, maybe a final motivation message for us, Mike, Steve.
Motivation. Wow. Making games is cool. There's your motivation. Steve, you got something or?
Go back to the one that I said before. No doesn't mean that it's the end of that game. There's always updating it and fixing it. I don't think a designer will ever think that their game is done. So there is a point to kind of send it off though, and feel like you've done the best you can, and that's important. And I will say that when your game is out there and you see someone play it and smile or laugh or, have a good time, that is the best feeling that you can get from a game.
It is. And everything Steve says is true. The other thing that you need to note that I think is listen to those people who are trying to play the game without you being there. We call it out of the box testing, if you will. You give them the box, they play the game. But listen to what they're saying and doing during your game. don't dismiss somebody who goes, I don't understand what's happening here. Don't go, oh, well, let me show you and do that kind of thing. No, that's actually the most important thing that you'll ever learn about your game is when somebody goes, I don't know what I'm doing right now. Because that means, one, you either weren't very clear or there's something that didn't work. That's actually probably the single most important piece of feedback you'll ever get is when that person says, I don't know what I'm doing right now. That is, making a game is 90% you listening to people you don't want to listen to. You don't want to hear them say, I don't know what I'm doing, but you need to actually listen to them. The other thing is, remember when you make a game and a publisher takes it, you're a part of the team. You're no longer the boss of the game now. You're part of a team. There's other people who are going to have as great a say, or maybe sometimes more say than you do, on what that product ends up being. As long as you understand that and you're willing to work with that, then you will go very, very far. The people that tend not to get work multiple times are the people who say, I'm bigger than the game. I'm bigger than the team. No, you're not. We all work together. If the artist comes to me, if the design team comes to me and says, can you make a change here because we're having trouble making this, I have to listen to them and decide whether to make a change. If the licensor says, and I won't even, Steve will start crying, but if the licensor says, do these 4 or 5 things, and you're like, I don't even know how to do that right now. What are you talking about? You have to figure that out. As much as I'm, you have to please me to get me to sell a game. I have to please, 6 other people in the office in order to get the game even produced. And that includes the production team. And China can't make this piece, or we need to cut 2 weeks out of the schedule in order to get it there. I have to work with that. I'm a part of a team, and you're part of that team. So always maintain that kind of mindset of I have an idea, and I've just showed it to somebody and they like my idea, and we're going to work together to get that idea into the public's hands. The together part is so important. I can't tell you how, and there's going to be conflict and there's going to be problems, and you're going to go, but that's the greatest part of the game, and that's the first thing cut, that kind of thing. We're going to always have those discussions and those arguments and those things. That makes it cool and fun and interesting, but we all have to pull together to get the product out the door so that we can sell it. It can become successful. You get good checks for a really long time of money, and we call you a second time to say, hey, let's work with this. Let's work with you again because that was a great experience. So the teamwork part tends to get talked about in these situations, but it's really important.
Okay.
I finally found what I want to send to Pepe, so I'm going to email this to you now, or should I put it in the chat? What is better?
You can send it to me. It's fine.
I just put it into the chat as
Okay.
we're saying it because it was open, and then there you go. So
Okay.
that everybody now has our basically what we call our development process. This is how we choose our games and who we are and what we look at. Oh, another thing too, it's not really your job, but it's something that you should know. And that is how much stuff costs. Okay. We tend to make a max our games out at about $40. Okay. So that if you look at something, $40 US, excuse me. So if you look at something like Horrified, which has a lot of cardboard, a lot of components, some miniatures, just a few dice. That's probably maxing out at what we're willing to spend as on our production side of things. Sending us a game with 200 dice in it, sending us we're going to say, is there any way not to have 200 dice? Can we reduce that number down? Villainous is at the high end mainly because of the sculptures. But there's all kinds of stages in that. If we ask you, hey, can you make this game be a $20 game? don't keep the same components as a $40 game. That we're going to say no, because we will ask for something very specific. So production costs are less than that. Like, think about it as what we consider on the production end is going to be, it's $40 for public. If we were making a $40 upfront game, I don't even think we even know what that is. But just look at what's already on the market. So if you're looking at a game for Ravensburger, a $40 game that maxes out almost at the highest end would be something like Horrified. I think the new Princess Bride is up there too. I think, but I'm not sure. Steve can know that, he worked on that game. But understand things like cards are cheap. Cardboard is cheaper than miniatures. Miniatures are expensive. Dice can come or go depending. If you want custom dice, they're more expensive than non-custom dice. So you run into this kind of thing that we know you don't know this information, but you also have to at least be somewhat aware of the parameters. So that's just a thing that I just saw as I sent that PowerPoint out. Pepe, I'll email it to you separately so you can share it with people who may not be on this call, or if you need it for a future. And like Steve said, at any time, if you have something that you're interested in, our contact information's in there.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. Let's give them an applause. Not a virtual one, a real one. So thank you for joining us.
Great.
We have a great time. And thank you so much.
Anytime, I'd be super happy to do this kind of stuff, because we want more and more people to become good inventors. And we don't do enough of this kind of helping new people, mentoring. And I keep talking to my supervisor saying this is the next step that we need to take here in the North American market, is to help do mentoring and bringing new inventors into the fold, always looking for new inventors. So
okay, thank you. And as I told you, we will share this presentation for all the Spanish people. Yeah.
Excellent, and thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad we met a couple weeks ago. This is actually pretty cool.
Yeah.
And hopefully you'll start to see a new, more interesting, more push into the Hispanic markets by the company soon. That's something that we're trying very hard to do. I think I wrote to somebody on there that we are looking at trying to get that taken care of and move forward company-wide. Doesn't really fall to the game team just yet, but that's something that they're trying to put together a plan for. So hopefully you'll see more of us in your market soon.
Thank you. See you. Nice to meet you, Steve.
All right, take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks
both
a
of you.
lot. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks.